I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This is the fourth installment in my Discussions in Philosophy series, and I want to present a question for discussion. And it's a very simple question. It has to do with the distinction between high and low context cultures. So if you're not familiar with the distinction of high and low context cultures, basically high context cultures are more collectivist cultures, meaning the content of their communication is very, very high, has a high degree of implicit rather than explicit content, cultural content that informs the nature of the discussion. In low context cultures, like the United States, the speaker in acts of communication is very, very literal, so that the context which is implicit is very, very small. So high context culture, more collectivist culture; low context culture, more individualistic culture. United States being an example of low context culture. The question has to do, however, with the idea of martyrdom and high and low context cultures. And the idea is, and the question is, and the discussion point is very simple. Is the act of martyrdom within high context cultures more socially recognized as a feasible mode of sort of actions within battle, actions within warfare? For example, the US versus Japanese kamikaze fighters in World War II, right? Not just an analysis of sort of the act of suicide by kamikaze fighters, but more importantly, the act of martyrdom or suicide as informed culturally in the distinction between sort of battle tactics, war tactics, versus high-low context mechanisms, manners in which battle unfolds. In a contemporary setting, the suicide bomber, similarly, like the Japanese kamikaze fighters, it's arguably the case that a high context culture informs, legitimizes, or justifies the sense of martyrdom that is used in an act of war. Now, on the flip side, conversely, it seems to be the case that within a low context culture like the United States of America, the great difficulty that American fighters have in battle, culturally speaking, has to do with how the American fighter is informed culturally. The American fighter is informed culturally to preserve individuality. In low context cultures, individuality is paramount. So how is it possible that if I am an American fighter, culturally informed through low context culture, to preserve my individuality, I am going to, and this is the question, am I going to be at a deficit in fighting an opponent who is more collectivistic in his or her cultural socialization? That's the question. And so I think it's a very important question to address. I don't have any answers. I never have any answers in the discussion points. I'd rather just put it out there for discussion. But it's something that I think is very important. Because if it's the case that our culture, American culture, informs American society, and not just American society, but any low context culture informs its society, and since members of military personnel are part of that society, then military personnel are going to have the preservation of life as paramount, individualistic. In sort of strategically attempting to weigh the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of fighting an enemy from a high context culture wherein that enemy in quotes, wherein that enemy views the collective as not necessarily more important than the individual, but is willing to sacrifice him or herself for the betterment of the collective. This is a pretty significant distinction. So the question has to do with, and there's many questions in here, but the nature of the general question is, what's the relationship between martyrdom and high and low context cultures in acts of war? So with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.